We're just talking about muscles and naming muscles from the lab list. So we're at a point in the lab where we don't have to talk about things that we can't really see with the naked eye, like we were diagramming neuromuscular junctions last time. In this lab, or in this class, there we go, we're just going to go through how muscles are named. We had introduced the muscular system last time and listed a few functions that we can give to the muscular system in addition to movement, helping you walk across the room. We said a lot of those muscles are there for just maintaining posture, helping you sit up straight in the chair. Stabilizing joints is another thing that muscles are important for. I said if you were to usually have to go through rehab if there's damage to a joint, a lot of that rehab is about strengthening the muscles around a particular joint to give it more stability. And we said muscles are capable of shivering to generate heat if you get too cold. You got the handouts from last time, right?
Yes.
Okay. We're just going to go through how muscles are named and then basically go through each of those muscles from the lab list and try and find them.
Professor, you started recording?
I think I did. Thanks for looking out. Hopefully it's focused. That thing sometimes goes blurry. Okay, first thing that we mentioned in here, and you'll see some of these questions in that lecture handout. Muscles are sometimes named after their origin and their insertion. Origin you can think of as the less movable end of a muscle, and the insertion is the more movable end of a muscle. It tends to be the case that the origin is more proximal to the point of attachment, and the insertion is more distal to the point of attachment. We talked about direct connection versus indirect connection of muscles last time. So this would be more of a direct connection where the muscle fiber is really attached to the periosteum of the bone. And this is an indirect muscle connection where those muscle fibers really attach to a tendon, and that tendon connects the muscle to the bone. Okay, so origin versus insertion. This particular muscle here, this palmaris longus, is what we call a biarticular muscle because it actually spans across two separate joints. It spans across the hinge joint of the elbow and these gliding joints of the wrist. Biarticular muscles are ones that just, again, cross two joints. This one is not a biarticular muscle because it just spans one joint. When we look at these muscles and discuss how they work, they typically work in these antagonistic pairs. And there are some questions in the back of this class handout where it's wanting you to know which of these muscles is considered the prime mover and which muscles are sometimes just assisting the prime mover. So prime movers are sometimes referred to as the agonist. In an example of me grabbing this marker, I guess, and lifting it up or flexing my arm, we'll see that the biceps is the prime mover. It's going to contract or flex, and in order for this to flex, the triceps has to relax. So the prime mover and the one that actually causes the muscle action is going to be our agonist or the prime mover, and the opposing muscle that has to do the opposite action, that has to relax in order for flexion to occur, is the antagonist. We'll see this over and over. Muscles work in these antagonistic pairs. I just talked about the biceps and the triceps as I held my arm out, but what's interesting is that those are not the only muscles involved in lifting this marker or lifting my coffee mug to take a drink. There are other muscles in the scapula that stabilize that shoulder blade and hold it in place so that I'm able to move my arm and it's not all wobbly. So the assisting muscles, the ones in the scapula, can be considered synergist. They're not the prime movers, but they assist the prime mover in various ways, like stabilizing certain joints, holding that scapula still so that my arm can move properly. Thinking about writing notes, you've got stabilizing muscles that are just holding your wrist still so that you're able to read your handwriting, while you've got agonist and antagonist that are moving the pencil or pen back and forth. We'll go through some more agonist and antagonistic pairs when we get into muscles of the leg. But back to this diagram, we did this last time, and it's going to be important to remember the steps of the diagram that we did. I'm going to grab a couple of colors, and we can do a quick little review. We put something up on the board last time that looked like this. We drew a muscle belly, and then here's kind of just my short reminder of each of those steps without drawing the whole thing that we did. We sketched a muscle belly, and when we looked inside that muscle belly, we saw it was split into muscle fascicles. There is one muscle fascicle that has been pulled out, but we see a bunch of different muscle fascicles in there. Muscle fascicles are really just bundles of muscle fibers. So if we look inside this fascicle, we can see a bunch of those muscle fibers. They've pulled one of them out. I'll say muscle fiber. This is the same thing as a muscle cell. So muscle fiber and muscle cell. If we look inside this muscle cell, we would see then organelles. And that main organelle that is responsible for the contraction of the muscle are all of those little tube-like organelles that we called myofibrils. And when we look inside those myofibrils, this is where I'm about to run out of room, there were 5 of those myofilaments. Myosin, actin, titin, troponin, and tropomyosin. So that's kind of where I was getting down to this second part. When we were looking at those myofibrils, we were sketching this long myofibril. We separated it up into those individual sarcomeres. Those Z lines separated an individual sarcomere. And within that sarcomere, we listed those 5 myofilaments that I just kind of briefly discussed. I'll hold off on that neuromuscular junction question. I wanted to come back up to this real quick while we're on this. And you can see just to the outside of the muscle belly, there is that connective tissue that we said was the epimysium that surrounds the muscle belly. And if we think about the connective tissue that surrounds the muscle fascicle, that was the perimysium. If we look at the connective tissue that surrounded the individual muscle cells or muscle fibers, we had that on the models that we were looking at. That was the endomysium. And if we were to actually look inside the cells, you know, the stuff that the myofibrils are floating around in, that's the cytoplasm of the cell. And instead of calling it cytoplasm in a muscle cell, it's called sarcoplasm. So these myofilaments are floating around in that sarcoplasm.
So on here where it says muscle fiber, that would be our sarcoplasm?
So the sarcoplasm would be all of the stuff in between those myofibrils. Right? And how we know that this is an actual cell is you can see the nuclei. And these skeletal muscle cells have multiple nuclei in them. They're really long cells. That's why they were originally just called muscle fibers, because you can see them with the naked eye, like when you're ripping apart fajita meat or pulled pork or something like that. The strands that you see are individual muscle cells. Any questions about that at all so far? Throw them out if you're thinking about them. Let me find my clicker. So we talked about these fascicles basically, and where we picked this up today is by looking at the direction that those fascicles run. That can sometimes help us distinguish one muscle group from the next. It's really helpful, for example, when you're looking at these intercostal muscles. I'm going to come over here and grab this chest plate. There are, when we're looking at these oblique muscles like external oblique versus internal oblique, which you can't see right now, or these intercostal muscles like external versus internal intercostal muscle, if you look closely, you can see the direction, sorry, I don't know how that happened, the direction that those fascicles run, and that will sometimes, like I said, help you distinguish one muscle group from the next. You can see which muscle group is superficial to another muscle group. Sometimes these fascicles are arranged in a circular pattern, and the name of the muscle is often given a circular name. So we can see the orbicularis oris is this circular muscle that surrounds the mouth. You would use that if you're puckering your lips, right? Sphincter muscles when we get to the digestive tract, are also made out of this circular muscle fascicles. I talked about intercostal muscles. Sometimes muscles are named after their location. That's the costal cartilage of the ribs. The space in between the ribs is intercostal space, and we would name those muscles there the intercostal muscles. This one that we're looking at here is going to be our external intercostal, and this is the internal intercostal. Both of these are on the lab list. Maybe if you have that lab list out, we can make some notes on it as we go through. And I'll point this out when we get into lab 2, but the external intercostal, it's more superficial than the internal intercostal. If you were to look at this and kind of let some of the light bounce off of it, you can tell that one of these muscle fascicles is running on top of the other. The more superficial one is the external intercostal. The other thing that you'll see is that the direction of those fascicles. If you look at this picture, the direction of the fascicles in the external intercostal are kind of coming, they originate back here in the vertebral column, and they're wrapping around, they're inserting almost towards the sternum. They don't quite touch the sternum. And it's really in that little space where these external intercostal muscles stop on the chest plate model that you can actually see that it reveals these internal intercostals. Look at this internal intercostal. This is a muscle that originates at the sternum. And the fibers try and insert around to the back of the vertebral column. They don't quite make it to the back of the vertebral column. We're going to see when this internal intercostal muscle compresses, it grabs the sternum and it compresses this chest plate. You use this internal intercostal muscle when you're trying to do a forceful exhale. Watch what happens if I put my hand on my chest and I force all the air out of my lungs. What I'm really doing there is I'm contracting this internal intercostal and like an accordion just squeezing my thoracic cavity to squeeze the lungs out. The external intercostal, if we look at this external intercostal, if this was to contract, what happens is it causes that sternum to elevate. It's like playing the accordion in the opposite way, drawing it out and pulling air into the accordion. If I put my hand on my chest and try and take in a deep breath, I'm just contracting this external intercostal. You'll see that it kind of pushes the sternum out a little bit, and that stretching of the thoracic cavity is what pulls air into or out of the lungs. So we'll see these intercostal muscles play a role in either inspiration or expiration.
So, sorry, it says lists the muscles involved in oral exhalation. So you said the intercostals. One says repeating, one says this group assists.
The other group that assist, you can just put the word tire, T-I-R-E. Each one of those letters is going to refer to a muscle in the, abdominal muscle. So that word tire just stands for the transverse abdominis, the external oblique, the internal oblique, and rectus abdominis. All of those abdominal muscles that are on the list. And you'll notice that if I were to stand up here and really try and force all the air out of my lungs, if I kept trying to push, eventually I would have to flex all of the muscles in this abdominal group. And they really assist in squeezing the rest of the air out of the lungs. All right, back to naming of muscles. Sometimes muscles are named based off of their shape, which is the case for this deltoid muscle. It made the lab list. An easy way to find this deltoid muscle would be on these torso models. You could also see the deltoid muscle on any of these arm models. Kind of a triangular or delta-shaped muscle. The origin is up here along the clavicle, and it inserts along that deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. You can also see, I don't know if this one made the lab list or not, but there is the trapezius muscle that's a trapezoid shape. There are also rhomboid muscles just underneath the trapezius that are rhomboid shaped. So muscles are sometimes named after their shape. They can also be named after their relative size, which is going to be the case with some of the muscles in the thigh. We'll see gluteus maximus or gluteus minimus. There's adductor longus, adductor magnus, adductor brevicus. We'll see several muscles named after their size. or named after the direction of the muscle fascicles. I was just talking about those abdominal muscles, and on some of these chest plates you'll see, well, some of them are just covered with epidermis, so we can't see any muscles underneath, but on the side that they've revealed muscles, at least on this chest plate, we can see this more superficial external oblique. Again, oblique because the fascicles are running in an oblique direction. Rectus is more of a vertical direction, so rectus abdominis refers to these fascicles that are running vertically. Internal oblique, this is an oblique layer of fascicles that are deep to the external oblique. And if we were to go underneath the internal oblique and underneath this rectus abdominis, the deepest layer of abdominal muscle is the transverse abdominis. You can see those fascicles running transversely. On this model that I'm holding up in front of us, we can see rectus abdominis, we can see external oblique, and if I flip this thing all the way around, on the back side you can see the muscle fascicles that are running transversely. So this would be the transverse abdominis. There isn't a really good place on this one that shows internal oblique, but I believe, let me check this other one. There's a couple of different torso models in here. The one that's back here isn't as new, but it has some advantages and disadvantages. And one of those is, sure enough, at least on this chest plate, we can see external oblique, rectus abdominis, and internal oblique. If we want to see transverse abdominis, we have to flip it over to the back. So, okay. We can find each of those. Sometimes muscles are named after their origin and their insertion. One example is this coracobrachialis. Its origin is this coracoid process of the scapula, and it inserts down here in the arm, the brachial area. So coracobrachialis is describing this muscle based on its origin and insertion. Another muscle that has a funny name but is also named after its origin and insertion, you can see the origin of the mastoid process on the temporal bone, and the insertion is the sternal end of the clavicle and a little bit of the sternum itself. So sternocleidomastoid is the name of this muscle that you would use to rotate your head side to side. Thinking about that real quick, there's something on the lecture handout where we're talking about that sternocleidomastoid. Let me see exactly which number this is. We're looking at number 27, 28, 29, 30, and 31. And it's really 30 and 31. I realize we haven't gone through all the muscles of the lab list yet, but since we've gotten to this sternocleidomastoid, there's a question there about the left or the right sternocleidomastoid. And there's questions there in 30 and 31 that are really wanting you to know which muscle is responsible for rotating the head versus tilting the head. And I just wanted to clarify those body movements. So rotating the head would be, you know, I'm looking forward here, and rotation would just be looking to that wall or looking to this wall. And look what happens. I don't know if this will pop out or not, but if I look over here, to rotate my head to the left, it's the right sternocleidomastoid. And if I rotate my head over here to the right, it's the left sternocleidomastoid. So rotating is the opposite. Like if I rotate to the right, it's the left sternocleidomastoid. If I rotate to the left, it's the right sternocleidomastoid. Versus tilting, this is tilting the head. You may be like the sad puppy dog look where somebody tilts their head like this. This is not a rotation movement. This is just a tilting movement. And if it's a tilting movement, it's the same side sternocleidomastoid. So to tilt my head over to the right, it's the right sternocleidomastoid. To tilt my head to the left, it's the left sternocleidomastoid. So I just wanted to clarify those body movements. The other ones there, like closing your eyelid or puckering your lips if you're whistling or chewing your food, we should cross those off the list when we get into the next PowerPoint, which is really just muscles from the lab list. This one really goes through naming classifications of muscles. I mentioned they're named after their origin and insertion, like the sternocleidomastoid. Sometimes they're named after their numbers of origins. In the case of the triceps brachii, there are 3 separate origins to this muscle and 1 insertion point. So triceps brachii is describing 3 origins versus the biceps brachii This is a muscle that is a double-bellied muscle that has 2 origins and 1 insertion. Just some examples of how these things are named. A lot of times muscles are named after their action. So flexion versus extension. We said flexion was decreasing the angle, extension was increasing that angle. Adductor was moving towards the midline, and then abduction is away from the midline. We have some adductor muscles that we'll learn in the leg or the thigh. So let's look at some of those. That was a short PowerPoint on naming classifications of muscle. The next one I'm going to pull up are really pictures that I think will help walk us through the muscles of the lab list. And we should be able to cross off the groupings of those muscles from our lecture handout. So I'm looking at the second page of the lab list, and we've got muscles of facial expression. We need to see the epicranius, which is really this, it's an aponeurosis, this sheet-like tendon that connects the muscle to the bone of the skull. The frontalis is the muscle that you would use to wrinkle your forehead. The occipitalis is the muscle that covers the occipital bone. In between there you have this epicranius, that little sheet-like tendon. If we look at the muscles that surround the eye, we said winking your eye, you would use this orbicularis oculi. And puckering your lips, you would use the orbicularis oris. Both of those have circular muscle fascicles and that orbicularis beginning to their name. Orbicularis oculi around the eye, orbicularis oris around the mouth. If we look at the muscles that help move the lower jaw, there is the masseter muscle, which is this main muscle that you see people use when they're chewing gum. So if you see somebody chewing gum, that main muscle right here in the cheek is the masseter muscle. And then also another muscle that you will feel in use if you're chewing, I forget what, one of those, like some of those healthy bars that you get that you can eat. For whatever reason, one of them, I think it's one of those Kind bars or whatever, I just have to chew it so much that the muscles in my head are tired of chewing that thing, but it's good. One of the muscles that you feel if you're chewing on something really long, again, this masseter as well as the temporalis muscle, that muscle that shields the temporal bone. We should be able to find both of those on these half-head models or even on some of the torsos that still have the heads attached to them.
Could you show where the masseter one is on the...
Sure. So the masseter, there's a parotid gland right on top of the masseter. So we can find the masseter muscle here. It would have a number 15 on it right here, just underneath this parotid gland. Temporalis is obviously shielding this temporal bone. We can find that one. Next one on the list is the sternocleidomastoid. And really this half-head model might be one of the better examples of the sternocleidomastoid. We can see the origin at that mastoid process of the temporal bone and the insertion down here at the sternal end of the clavicle. You could also see a little bit of it here on the torso models, but it's kind of cut in half, so I'm not sure if that's practical quality. I probably would prefer these half-head models for that sternocleidomastoid. Here's another one that I need to look at real quick. This might not end up on the lab list at all, but the erector spinae is a muscle that you would use to straighten the spine. So, if you're ever kind of just too slouched over in your chair and you just want to sit up straight, the muscle that you use to straighten your back up is this erector spinae muscle. I feel like I have a picture of it somewhere up here. Let me catch up with my slides. We mentioned all of these, this cheek-like masseter, that temporalis that covers the temporal bone, that sternocleidomastoid that you would use to rotate your head side to side. Which one am I looking for? I'm looking for the erector spinae muscle. And I don't even have a picture of it. So not shown here, but just below this, there's an erector spinae muscle that goes to the vertebral column and helps you straighten up your spine. It looks like I've removed that one from the slide because we don't have one of those models in the lab list. So erector spinae, we'll maybe describe that as a muscle that helps you straighten up your back, but it won't end up on the lab practical. I can't stick a pin in it anywhere. So moving down the list, we said there were the abdominal muscles. I'll just jump down to number 6 to go through those muscles of the abdominal wall. I held up a couple of those chest plates. This one shows all of those muscles are external oblique on this side. The external oblique has been removed on the other side to reveal this rectus abdominis and the internal oblique. Again, transverse abdominis would be along the back side. There it is. The deepest layer is that transverse abdominis.
Are some of these are some of these blue because they're not muscles? Like you know how like up there where it's like some is red and some is blue?
So if it's this type of stuff, that is connective tissue. Those are sheet-like tendons that will attach this muscle usually to some other piece of connective tissue. This linea alba is a layer of tendon that runs between those muscles to give them all an attachment point.
Thank you.
So is your internal oblique kind of like under your abs?
The internal oblique, that's right, it would go underneath that transverse abdominis. And there was one of those, you had asked the question about the muscles involved in a forceful exhale. There's the internal intercostal and then the group that assists that muscle. The group that assists that are all of these abdominal muscles. I gave you that acronym of TIRE, just standing for transverse abdominis, internal oblique, rectus abdominis, and external oblique. That's in the order of deepest layer to most superficial layer as well. No problem. Kind of jumping around the lab list. Looking now at number 5 on the lab list, the diaphragm and those intercostal muscles. This diaphragm is this sheet-like muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. And the best place to find it on any of these torso models, you can see it here. It's just this little sheet-like line that the lungs sit directly on top of. In reality, when you take in a deep breath, this diaphragm will drop down and stretch these lungs out. Again, playing them like an accordion, stretching them out so that air can rush in. So we can find the diaphragm muscle. Let's see. Yeah, grab, I think these are the ones from yesterday.
Yeah.
You got both of those on the lab list. Mm-hmm. I haven't got to actually put the questions on the practice practical yet, but I'll do that whenever we... That was yesterday.
Okay, can I see that?
Sure. I also got that video posted online, so you can watch that one already. Let me know if we have any questions out there as we're going through this. Here's actually the picture I was just describing. The diaphragm is the muscle that the base of the lungs sit directly on top of. And when you take in a deep breath, this diaphragm drops down, and it pulls the bottom of the lungs with it. In addition to the lungs being pulled down, the base of the lungs being pulled down, we can see the rib cage is also elevated whenever you take in a deep breath, and that's the role of that external intercostal muscle. So in thinking of these muscles involved in normal breathing, like when you're just sitting there writing notes, you're not exerting yourself, so you would use this external intercostal and the diaphragm muscle to stretch the lungs out a little bit so air rushes in, and all you have to do is just relax those muscles and you have what would be a normal exhale. If we started to, instead of writing notes, if we got out here and started to run up and down the stairs to the point where we started to exert ourselves and really do this forceful breathing, you know, if we're that exhausted, then you're getting into more of this forceful breathing. And in a forceful exhale, it's not just relaxing the external intercostal and the diaphragm, but you involve these muscles like the internal intercostal and the rest of those abdominal wall muscles that really help force air out of the lungs. So muscles of inspiration. Here we are where we get to the muscles that help move the scapula.
Sorry.
Yeah.
For the normal inspiration, so it's the external intercostal, that's the prime mover, and the assist is the diaphragm?
I would say the prime mover there would be the diaphragm, and the assisting muscle there would be the external intercostal.
All right, thank you.
No problem. So now we're looking at the back part of the torso here. One of the muscles that we can see on the list is this trapezius muscle. It's a trapezoid-shaped, sheet-like muscle that's the most superficial muscle if you look at, well, if you look at these torso models, you can see a little bit of that trapezius muscle, but the rest of it has been cut away. Maybe the best place to find the trapezius muscle, we can see just a portion of it on the back side of these half-head models. So this is the trapezius, this sheet-like muscle. The other muscles that you can find on these arm models, you can see there's the spine of the scapula, and we've got these muscles above or below the spine. We even have muscles underneath the scapula. Now the muscles have been kind of removed on this side so that we can see the scapula itself, but there are these muscles that stick out underneath the spine that we need to know. In addition to the deltoid muscle that we have to know, there's the infraspinatus muscle. Look at how that infraspinatus muscle, it has several different bellies. So I'll just get really close. You see how there's just one number 7 right there, and there's nothing on the rest of those? All of that is one muscle, the infraspinatus. That's the teres minor, and this is the teres major. I know, and that's the supraspinatus. I know that's a lot, but above or below the spine, we can only see the infraspinatus. I pointed to that teres minor, and then there's the teres major. Teres major on this model has a number 9 on it. The infraspinatus has a number 7, and the supraspinatus has a number 6. Subscapularis has a number 5. Is that all the ones that are on there? I'm not even on the right part of the list yet. It looks like I'm telling you stuff that is on the lecture handout, not actually on the list. Let's look at that lecture handout. Since we're naming those muscle groups, there are muscles of the rotator cuff. There's 4 muscles there of the rotator cuff, and we can see almost all of them. Here are 2 muscles of the rotator cuff, this infraspinatus that we mentioned, as well as the teres minor. So teres major is not part of the rotator cuff. If we look at...
You said the minor is not?
The minor is, the teres major is not. Yeah. So teres minor, the infraspinatus. If I jump over to this picture, we can see the subscapularis, which is also part of that rotator cuff muscle. And here's a better picture of all of them. You can see we've basically just removed the trapezius, that sheet-like muscle, and we can see the muscles that help move the scapula. There's the supraspinatus above the spine of the scapula, the infraspinatus with those multiple muscle bellies. There is the teres minor, all of them inserting there at the proximal end of the humerus. And then there's the teres major, which is not part of the rotator cuff muscle. The teres minor is, teres major would not be. The only one not on the list, we can see supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor. The 4th one is the subscapularis on the underside of the scapula. So that did make the lecture handout, just not the lab list. Let me
So the 4 that
try not to.
rotator cuff is the minor, the infra... I didn't write the word.
Spinatus, infraspinatus, supraspinatus, subscapularis, teres minor.
Thank you.
No problem. We could also see some other muscles while I was jumping around on there. There's what I was at on the lab list, the pectoralis major, the pec muscles. There are a couple of them that are floating around. They sometimes fall off. Here's one that has a mammary gland on it, but there is a pectoralis major muscle that if we want to show that, we need to add it here. The chest plates that I was holding up a second ago, if you look at these chest plates, there is a small muscle just underneath this pectoralis major. This one is the pectoralis minor. It's got a number 261 on it, so for pectoralis minor.
Do you see the pectoralis minor on that one you just put up there?
No. I mean, I guess you could see a little edge of it there, but I wouldn't consider that practical quality. but this sits right on top of this part of the chest plate. So if we remove the pectoralis major, you can see just underneath it is the pectoralis minor. There's my list. What else do we have? The other thing that I can point out on here, if you look at the edge of the torso model, if I put this chest plate on there, you can see these muscles that kind of make their way around the lateral side of the torso have this jagged edge at their anterior end. This jagged edge, kind of like a serrated blade on a knife, this is the serratus anterior. So pectoralis major, pectoralis minor, this trapezius muscle, as well as the serratus anterior are on the lab list. I don't know if that was a question. The next, number 8 on the list, is the muscles that move the arm. One of them I had pointed to on this model, the teres major, is the largest muscle, kind of the largest muscle attached here to the inferior edge of the scapula. Using this and these pictures, let's see where else. We said the latissimus dorsi and the deltoid are on there. We've pointed to this deltoid-shaped muscle along the shoulder. And then the latissimus dorsi is this muscle that kind of originates in the axillary area and comes down and inserts along the lumbar region of the spine. You can see these large sheet-like muscles on the torso models. If you look under here, this, again, sheet-like muscle that comes up and makes its way into this axillary region. Latissimus dorsi, this one has a number 541 on it. The serratus anterior that I mentioned has a 542 on it. All right, and I pointed to that teres major. Let me tell you what number is on the teres major. It has a number 9 on it. I think I said that earlier. Teres minor does not have a number on it, but I can see that one actually didn't make the lab practical list. We do need to know it for lecture, though. It's part of those rotator cuff muscles.
So, radius dorsi, sorry, I said it wrong. That's the muscle you work when you're doing like lat pulls?
Lat pulls, that's right. So you would use this muscle when you're swimming. That's one of the questions. Doing the like hammering something down, any kind of rowing or pulling motion, that's this latissimus dorsi.
What number was that one again?
Number 8.
The number that's on this latissimus dorsi on this model is 541. Okay, so muscles that move the, where are we at? Muscles that move the forearm is where we are. So biceps brachii flexes this forearm. Triceps brachii will extend the forearm. Again, we can see triceps along the back. I'll just use this model. We have biceps brachii. This has a number 11 on it. Triceps brachii has a number 17 on it. And then there is a muscle in between the biceps and the triceps that is on our lab list. I don't know if I have a picture of it from the side. It's the brachialis muscle. We don't have a picture of it on here. I'll just try and hold this up. So in between the biceps brachii and the triceps brachii, there's the brachialis muscle. It's got a number 14 on it. Now we're down into muscles that move the thigh and the leg.
I have a question.
Yes.
So you said the biceps brachii, they do what?
Biceps brachii flexes this forearm. Triceps brachii extends the forearm. Now we're at muscles that move the leg, and it looks like it's a kind of a long list of muscles that move the leg. The first picture that we were seeing here are some of the gluteal muscles. So we have the gluteus maximus, there's the gluteus medius. Underneath the gluteus medius is the gluteus minimus, but that one didn't make the lab list. Gluteus maximus and gluteus medius did. And you'll notice on this torso model, those have been cut. You can see the gluteus maximus muscle has been cut, And then the gluteus medius muscle that runs along the edge of that iliac crest has also been cut and removed. You can see the gluteus minimus, but that one didn't make the lab list. We can see a little bit of gluteus maximus and gluteus medius. So next one's on the list. If we go to the front of the leg, there are two of these muscles that actually come from the abdominal region, and then they make their way down into the proximal part of the thigh. These two muscles that come from this abdominal region, one of them is the iliacus, and it's on the inside edge of the ilium. If I can just kind of point, well, that one's not going to work. Let's go to this one where we've removed some of the digestive organs. When we look to the inside of this model, you can see there's a sheet-like muscle that is kind of just covering up the inside edge of the ilium. That is the iliacus. And right, if you want to put this down, the iliacus has a number 356 on it. And then right next to it, I know it might be difficult to see from the other side of the room, there's another muscle that comes in. It's really originating from the lumbar vertebrae, and it's making its way out to the groin region. It has a number 357 on it. That's the psoas major. And these are both muscles, again, coming from this abdominal region right down into the groin. So we see a little bit of that iliacus and a little bit of this psoas major that make their way down into the groin region.
Where does the psoas major come from? You said one's
It-
coming from
Yeah, let me see if I have another picture of it. I guess I don't.
sorry.
I'm just checking to see if and I don't. We'll look at this when we get our hands on some models. The psoas major, it actually originates in the lumbar vertebrae. It's this larger muscle. You can see there's one on either side, so it's coming more medially and spreading out more laterally towards both of those groins.
You said more medial?
It originates medially on the lumbar vertebrae and then spreads out laterally into each groin region. Back to the lab list. Next one on the lab list is this sartorius muscle. This is easy to recognize because it's this ribbon-like muscle that runs diagonally across the anterior side of the thigh. I'm going to come over here and grab one of these leg models to see if I can show you what I'm talking about. Well, I know I just left my lab list, but this ribbon-like muscle that kind of runs diagonally across the anterior side of the leg is the sartorius muscle. It's the leg that you would use if you're sitting in a chair and crossing your legs. You would use this sartorius muscle. It actually gets its name from the word sartor, which is Latin for tailor, somebody that would sit there and sew clothes. So this sartorius muscle, or the tailor muscle, is the one that you would use to cross your legs. Anterior side of the thigh, this ribbon-like muscle. Next one on the lab list happens to be, let's see what it is. We've talked about gluteus maximus and gluteus medius. So the next thing on the list is this tensor fasciolata. That's clearly not a muscle, but that tensor fasciolata is this little bit of muscle that attaches to the iliotibial tract. If I hold this thigh up, if we look along the lateral side, here's our tensor fasciolata. You see it attaches to this iliotibial tract, this long band of connective tissue. There's our iliotibial tract, and a little bit of that tensor fasciolata that attaches to it.
What does it do?
It's going to be one of the things that helps in the abduction of the thigh. Speaking of adduction of the thigh, the next one is adductor longus and adductor magnus. Grabbing this pointer. This, it's going to be easy when we can grab this thigh and get it in your hand and kind of rotate it around. But for reference, this close side of the picture, our anterior view, we can see this sartorius. And if we make our way around the medial side of the leg, one of the muscles I like to use as a point of reference when I'm looking at the thigh muscles, there is the sartorius, and then there's also this vertical muscle that runs right down the medial side of the thigh called the gracilis. Looking at this thigh, this is the vertically running gracilis. It has a number 13 on the gracilis. The sartorius has a number 24 on it. In between, if we look just in between the sartorius and this gracilis, there is a muscle. It looks like that's a number 14. And I'm realizing that as I'm throwing these numbers out to you, I was talking about number 14 on the arm model. There's also a number 14 on the leg model. So these might not be the best way to talk about it in a group, but make sure you get your hands on this, and you'll see right between the sartorius muscle and the gracilis muscle is our adductor longus. That's the largest muscle that we can see. There is a little bit of a, did this pectineus muscle make the lab list? It did. It's right underneath this adductor. We have to know adductor magnus, which is more along the posterior side. I'm missing one muscle from the back side of this thigh. We can see gracilis from the back, this posterior side. This is the adductor magnus, kind of coming at a diagonal. Let me get the other muscle from the back of the leg. Is it that one? No. Okay, well, this one at least has the muscles intact from the thigh. We're missing some of the calf muscles, so I'll just go back and forth. We should be able to see from the anterior view of the leg, just not even looking at the lab list, looking at the muscles that we see. Running vertically up and down the anterior side of this thigh is the, what am I trying to say? Rectus femoris. Rectus is always vertical up and down, and femoris tells us it's on top of that femur. So rectus femoris is one of these muscles that forms the quadriceps. There are 4 muscles in the quadriceps. Rectus femoris is the first one. It is flanked on either side by these large muscles. So vastus describes these large muscles on either side of the rectus femoris. There's the vastus lateralis on the lateral side and the vastus medialis on the medial side. So those 3 made the lab list, but there is one right underneath the rectus abdominis. If I lift the rectus abdominis up, it doesn't show it very well other than this sheet of connective tissue, but there is a vastus intermedialis. Vastus intermedialis is the 4th muscle that makes up the 4 muscles of the quadriceps. So quadriceps muscles, anterior side of the thigh, rectus femoris, vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, and then vastus intermedialis is underneath that rectus femoris.
You said it's the 4 muscles.
4 muscles of the quadriceps, anterior part of the thigh. There's 3 muscles that make up the hamstring, the posterior part of the thigh, and we're about to rotate around to the back of this to see these muscles here of the hamstring. The 3 muscles of the hamstring, looking at the posterior part of the thigh, the first 2 to mention are right on top of one another. The semitendinosus and semimembranosus are 2 muscles of the hamstring. The third one is this biceps femoris. So on the lecture handout, if you just want to list muscles of the hamstring, there's biceps femoris, semimembranosus, and semitendinosus. How we can find them, again, it's not immediately obvious when you're looking at the 2-dimensional surface, but when you're holding this leg up and we're looking at the back side of the thigh, there, you can look at the big toe just to find medial from lateral. The muscle group that is more lateral is the biceps femoris. If we look at the muscle group that's on the medial side of the thigh, medial and posterior side of the thigh, there's actually 2 muscles right here. The one that is on top is the semitendinosus. And this semitendinosus, I remember the T in tendinosus because it tells me 2 things about that semitendinosus: that it is on top of the semimembranosus, and also that it tapers, it narrows like a tendon would. And when we're looking at this semitendinosus, if you follow that semitendinosus all the way down, look at right there where the semitendinosus kind of tapers and it narrows. As that semitendinosus narrows, what it reveals is you can see underneath the underneath that semitendinosus the whole time was this wide membrane-like muscle called the semimembranosus. And sometimes these muscles fall off of these models, so I want to be careful so that it doesn't get me. But if I hold this up closely, we can see this muscle on top is the semitendinosus. And you can see at the very distal end there, when it starts to narrow and taper, now it reveals that semimembranosus that was underneath there the whole time. All right.
So both of those are, it's just one, the ones on top?
This is actually two muscles. I know it is just in one piece here on the model, but they're actually two muscles. They are part of one muscle group, the hamstring. There's three muscles in that muscle group.
They're part of the hamstring.
That's right. Three muscles function as part of the hamstring. Those three muscles are semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and biceps femoris.
Can we see the biceps femoris on that model?
The biceps femoris is the other large muscle belly that's on the lateral side of the thigh. Like looking at it from a distance, it probably looks like there's just two big muscle bellies here. One of them on the lateral side is the biceps femoris, and the other big muscle belly is the semitendinosus. Because you have to realize that the semimembranosus is right underneath that semitendinosus, and you don't ever notice it until this tendinosus starts to taper, and then it reveals right there at the bottom the wide semimembranosus, almost in this popliteal region, the back side of the knee. And biceps femoris on the lateral side, right next to that iliotibial tract.
So the muscle closest to you on your model that you're holding, that one's the bicep.
Biceps femoris, that's right.
Okay.
Semitendinosus and semimembranosus would be on the other side.
Thank you.
And the bicep, from the anterior part?
Biceps femoris would be posterior and lateral. It's part of that hamstring. Let's see, so we've gotten through the four muscles of the quadriceps, the three muscles of the hamstring. Let's go ahead and cross off these muscles that attach to the Achilles tendon. There's our Achilles tendon. And the two muscles that attach that contribute to this Achilles tendon, there's the gastrocnemius muscle, this double-bellied calf muscle that made the lab list. And then underneath that gastrocnemius muscle, there's the soleus. Here's the leg model that has this double-bellied muscle of the gastrocnemius. So both of those represent the gastrocnemius. And then we can see the other muscle that also contributes to that Achilles tendon is the soleus. It's right underneath the gastrocnemius. Okay, so we've pointed out rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis. We said that vastus intermedialis is not visible on any of the models. We talked about biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus. I just pointed out gastrocnemius and soleus, and I forgot to show you on the anterior side of this leg is our tibialis anterior, just on the anterior side of the tibia. Then the last ones, it looks like there are a few tendons or aponeuroses that we need to know. I pointed out that gala aponeurotica, which is the sheet-like tendon, and aponeurosis is a sheet-like tendon. That first one is this sheet-like tendon on the top of the skull. The frontalis and the occipitalis are anchored to that aponeurotica. Linea alba, we'll set that down. Linea alba, we said, was that line of connective tissue that runs just between the rectus abdominis. And then,
Your ab line.
correct, yeah, linea alba. Then the last one is the Achilles tendon or calcaneal tendon. So the soleus and gastrocnemius contribute to that.
Excuse me, can you go back over
Sure, what was the question again?
just all the tendons and the thing that you just...
Tendons and aponeuroses, that's right. So if we look at the top of the skull here, pull this thing off, there is this white area that represents the gala aponeurotica. It's a sheet of connective tissue that's on top of the skull. The frontalis and the occipitalis are all anchored to that sheet of connective tissue. Then we had the linea alba, which was that line of connective tissue that runs vertical just in between the rectus abdominis. And then the other one, what did we say? The Achilles tendon, which is not on there. Where did my... There's the other leg that's got the calf muscles on it that shows this Achilles tendon. Things that used to be on that list is this iliotibial tract that somehow is no longer on that list. But I remember I pointed it out earlier for, I don't know, some reason. Okay, so we've made it through the lab list. I'm going to go back to grabbing the lecture handout to see if I missed anything there. We talked about those 4 muscles of the rotator cuff. We talked about those muscles of the abdominal wall, these core muscles. We talked about the muscles involved in inspiration or expiration, normal breathing or forceful breathing. So that should be everything. Let's just quickly scan through the rest of those to see if I can help give hints. We mentioned closing your eyelids, like if you're winking at somebody, you would use this orbicularis oculi. If you're puckering your lips because you're whistling at somebody, this is the orbicularis oris. We said the masseter is what you would use to chew your food, that cheek muscle. And I talked about the difference between rotating versus tilting the head for that sternocleidomastoid. There is a question down there beneath that for, looks like 32 through 34, where we're talking about that erector spinae. So if you're in one of these positions and you just want to straighten your back up so that you're standing up straight, that's the erector spinae muscle that you would use. Then we have some other actions. Let's just express what's going on there. Extending the spine and maintaining the posture, we said, was the erector spinae muscle. So let me make a distinction between the other two, which are flexing your vertebral column as you bend forward from the waist. Here is flexing this vertebral column as I bend forward from the waist. If you were to do this, what you would feel is that you're using some of these abdominal muscles, but it's mostly those oblique muscles. Versus, let's say, compression of the abdomen. If you have been on like a roller coaster that throws you around a lot, what you try and do is you compress that abdomen, and what you're really doing is you're using that transverse abdominis. That's the one that allows you to compress the abdomen. There is, I don't know why I'm saying this, but there is I have to ride these long back roads home, and there's one of them on the way to Cameron where it's this long flat road, and then there's like this bump that you have to go over. And if you're going like over 80 miles an hour, we'll say the speed limit. If you're going the speed limit and you go over that bump, it kind of throws your abdominal organs up, and it makes you kind of feel light in the stomach. I'm sure I hate roller coasters. I never go on them. I grew up in a small town where I saw people putting those things together and taking them down on the weekend, and I just lost all my faith in them. But if you like those things, they jostle around your internal organs, and one thing that you can do to prevent that stomach queasy feeling is really compress that transverse abdominis. It forces all your abdominal organs to stay. Well, I mean, flex would be any kind of flexing of a muscle, but if you flex the transverse abdominis, you're really kind of tightening all those internal organs, and I'm describing it as something that you would likely do if you're on one of those roller coasters, or I do whenever I hit that bump because I don't want to feel my stomach jump in the air. Solves it. Anyway, just trying to describe those different actions right there. Let's see what else. The questions on the back side of the page, some of these are obvious, but other ones you might actually, if you needed some help with figuring these out, you may have noticed on the pages that I gave you that are kind of just these additional pages, after you get through the pages which are pictures of the muscle man front and back, you've got these tables. These are not immediately... Sure, I think this is another one. There are, those tables aren't immediately obvious with how to read, but you can see the top columns are telling you what type of muscle action, whether it's flexion, extension, what the muscle is doing. And then there's an X there that tells you which muscle is responsible for that particular movement. I just made copies of those for everybody because that's where the answers to these multiple choice things came from. It's actually from an older version of a textbook, so I went ahead and copied those and gave you copies of those pages. But we can think some of these things through. There's only a couple of them that are not obvious from that list that I gave you. So let's go through a few of these things. I wanted to point out, let's see, starting at the top, we talked about the swimming or hammering or rowing motion earlier. Any of that type of pulling motion is going to be the latissimus dorsi. So letter C, just latissimus dorsi all by itself, is for number 19, the hammering, the swimming, and the rowing. And the other one that I wanted to give away is the one that's about climbing, throwing, or really pushing something. This pushing motion is what you would use the pectoralis major for. So the pectoralis major, this is the pushing motion. So for number 18, there's an option that's just pectoralis major all by itself. That's letter F. That is going for the throwing and the pushing motion. You can see, well, number 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 all come directly from the tables that I gave you. So let me go through number 11 and 12 real quick. Number 11, shrugging of the shoulders. This is actually, there are two muscle groups involved in shrugging of the shoulders. That's the last page of that handout. What's that? There? Yeah, backside of that page. Shrugging of the shoulders, like we said, there are two muscle groups involved in shrugging of the shoulders. It's going to be the levator scapula and the trapezius, just the superior fibers of the trapezius. So that's letter E.
411.
411. Number 12 is H. Flexing. So this is flexing the arm as you lift anteriorly, kind of, I don't know, doing an uppercut. Flexing the arm as you lift it anteriorly.
What's that?
H, that's two muscle groups. That's the pectoralis major and the anterior fibers of the deltoid muscle. If we just wanted to extend the arm, so this extension of the arm, straighten this out, there are going to be, in extending this arm, two muscle groups. There's the latissimus dorsi and the posterior fibers of the deltoid. So letter D for number 13. Abduction of the arm is away, and then adduction of the arm is towards the midline. If you just abduct your arm and hold it out to the side like this, you're using all of the fibers of the deltoid muscle. So abducting the arm, that's deltoid muscle, all fibers. Adducting the arm, pulling it down towards the side. Again, you're doing kind of this pulling motion. You're adducting right back down towards the midline. So that pulling motion is going to involve some of the latissimus dorsi, but it also involves that pectoralis major muscle. So if we're thinking of adducting the arm, number 15, that's letter I, pectoralis major and the latissimus dorsi. Might as well knock off the other two, which is just simply flexing the forearm. Just flexing of the forearm all by itself. This is biceps brachii and the brachialis, letter A.
How does your bicep pull your forearm up? Is it like a lever?
Yeah, and actually that question, it really makes me wish that we used to do this chicken wing dissection, but now there's a safety issue with it. But if you were to take like a chicken wing and pull the skin off of the chicken wing, there's two muscles that you can pull on. Again, it shows that muscles work in these antagonistic pairs, and if you were to contract or shorten the biceps, it acts like a lever to pull this muscle up. And then if I were to shorten the triceps, it acts like a lever to pull this thing down. So the muscles always work by pulling. So pulling this up with the biceps or kind of extending it out with the triceps. That's hopefully close enough. I think I was at number 16, flexing the arm. That's biceps brachii and brachialis. Extending the forearm is the triceps brachii. Just J. Crossing off the ones down there in the legs. So we talked about the muscle that you would use in crossing the legs. The talar muscle. Sartorius. Oh, 13. Extending the arm. Extending the arm is going to be D. So extending the arm out is going to be reaching the whole arm out, not just the forearm. So that's what involves some of those muscles. In extending the arm, that would be letter D, latissimus dorsi, and the posterior fibers of the deltoid muscle. 13 was D. Anybody else miss one of those when we ran through that? Did you get 13? So I was at number 20, crossing the legs. We said that was the talar muscle or the sartorius muscle. And then we've got either adducting the thigh or abducting the thigh. If we're going to pull it towards the midline, adducting the thigh, as you might suspect, those are the adductor muscles, as well as the gracilis and pectineus. If we are abducting the thigh, if we're pulling it away, that's if you abduct your thigh, you'll feel that gluteus medius, one of those gluteal muscles working. Let's see, extending at your knee. So extending at my knee, there is what we would use this, try and straighten your leg out at your knee. You're going to feel this quadriceps muscle burning. So quadriceps femoris, those quad muscles for extending the knee. Flexing your knee, if this is extending my knee, holding it straight out, flexing my knee is going to be curling my knee up like this. And the muscle that you would use to flex at the knee, this gets us into those hamstring muscles. Where am I at? Flexing at the knee is biceps femoris, semitendinosus, and semimembranosus. We said those hamstring muscles. Then we have plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. We know plantar flexion is when you're slamming down on the gas. So let's look at this picture of these muscles in the feet. I went too far. If we're looking for plantar flexion, if we want these toes to go down, and this is kind of your comment earlier about how these muscles work. If we want the toes to go down, then we need to shorten the muscle in the back. And that causes these things to go down. So that would be flexion of the calf muscles. Where's that at? Gastrocnemius and the soleus for plantar flexion. If we want to raise our toe off the gas pedal, so bringing the toes up closer to the knee, well then we would want to shorten the muscle or contract the muscle on the anterior side of the tibia. So tibialis anterior is for dorsiflexion. Okay, let's see. We've gotten through the muscles from the lab list. We've gotten through the lecture handout, even though that was kind of brief. I've got blank copies of a practice lab practical that I have to set up. And really at the same time, we just need to go through the muscle models and find each of these things so that you can see it with your own eyes.
Can we go over the part of the lecture handout that was like naming them based on the origin and insertion? Like the very first page?
Sure, yeah. We should be able to figure that one out too. So let's go through, looking at number 4, we have a question about, you're given the names of the muscles there, and then describing the origin and insertion. I think one thing that's helpful with this part is, since we've just gone over the bones, if you can't find one of these muscles, kind of helping find those particular structures, it kind of maps out. So one of those muscles, it has an origin at the manubrium of the sternum, the medial side of the clavicle, and the mastoid process of the temporal bone. So if you can think in your head, where was that mastoid process? Where am I going to find that mastoid process, or the medial side of the clavicle bone? There should be only one of those muscles from the list that would fit that area. Sternocleidomastoid, so we got that one off the list. Now here's the next one. We've got an origin that's at the lateral third of the clavicle. There's the acromion and spine of the scapula. It inserts at the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. Yeah, let's go back to this one. There is some clues in one of these pictures that we saw. You're right, I think it is in this picture. For biceps and triceps muscle, I guess it's not really saying on there, but the one that has an insertion at the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus that covers the third of the clavicle, that acromion part of the spine. This is all describing the shoulder region. And really the insertion of that deltoid tuberosity is another clue. This is describing the deltoid muscle for number 5. Number 6, you've got an origin. It looks like there is one origin of the coracoid process. Another origin is the tubercle just above the glenoid cavity and the lip of the glenoid cavity itself. The insertion is the tendon of the radial tuberosity. This is describing the biceps brachii. And I felt like there was a slide somewhere that went over those origins. Maybe it didn't, and we just have to say this with our words. Biceps brachii, one of the insertion points of the biceps brachii is the radial tuberosity. That's how you can tell the difference between biceps brachii and triceps brachii. One of the insertion points of the triceps brachii is on the ulna, that olecranon process of the ulna. So you can connect triceps brachii, at least one of the insertion points, and the ulna, that olecranon process, versus the biceps brachii that attaches to the radius. So those are on two different sides of the humerus, and they're going to insert on two different bones in the forearm. That might be the hardest one on here, because the next one might be kind of obvious. We're thinking of that anterior inferior iliac spine. So on the anterior side, just below that crest of the iliac spine, there's the superior margin of the acetabulum and the greater trochanter. So this is all describing parts of the thigh down here, and the insertion is the patella and tibial tuberosity. We're describing one of those muscles of the thigh, and the only one there from the list is the rectus femoris. No other thigh muscles are there. We've got, in number 8, there's the ischial tuberosity that's going to the head of the fibula. So there's biceps femoris, so there's two muscles, I guess, in the thigh. But you can see one of them is describing more of a posterior side. That linea aspera is along the posterior side of the femur. So that's the clue that's telling you hamstring, the posterior side.
So that's the biceps femoris.
Biceps femoris is number 8. Yes, linea aspera, the distal part of that femur, that's telling us the back side of the femur, biceps femoris. Then number 9, we've got medial and lateral condyles of the femur. And then the other clue is the calcaneus via the calcaneal tendon. So that is describing one of those calf muscles down there. That would be the gastrocnemius. And then the last one, number 10, this is describing, well, it says right there, the posterior shaft of the humerus. And then the clue down there is the insertion point on the ulna. So humerus to ulna is always going to be triceps brachii. If it's humerus to the radius, it's the other one, the biceps brachii. So biceps and triceps with those two insertion points might be the most difficult to distinguish on that part of the lecture handout. Did we get all of the namings of the muscle groups?
Can we go over the quadriceps again?
Yes, 4 muscles that make up the quadriceps. You should have rectus femoris, the vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, and then the vastus intermedialis. It was only the intermedialis that didn't make the lab list. But you might see questions on the exam where there's like multiple choice questions, like which one of the following muscles is not part of the quadriceps?
Wait, I'm sorry, you said vastus intermedius, that is part of the quadriceps?
That is part of the
But it's not on
quadriceps.
the lab list.
Not on the lab list because we didn't have a model that shows it. I think I even put that note on the lab list, not visible on lab models.
Yeah.
So making note cards like this, so 3 muscles of the hamstring, biceps femoris, semitendinosus, and semimembranosus, there's going to be questions, I'm sure, on the exam that which one of these muscles is not part of the hamstring muscles. So just kind of knowing how these muscles are grouped together will help navigate you through multiple choice questions on the lecture exam. As far as the lab goes, if I can stick a pin on it or a sticker, then just visually recognizing where that muscle is located will be sufficient. Any of the other ones for muscle groupings? Feel okay about that? I think we got through the rest of it. So that's it in terms of lecture. So we can take a little 5-minute break. During that time, I'm going to set up a practice practical. And all we will do after that point is I'm just going to make rounds to help you find all of these things on the lab model. It's kind of a short lab because it's not structures of the muscle. We just have to find the muscle and know its name. Once we've done that, we can take a couple of laps through the practice practical. If you have questions about our discussion last time about this neuromuscular junction or drawing these myofilaments, I'd be glad to jump back into that. All right, I'm going to kill this. Take a break if you want. I'll set up the practice practical and just make laps and answer questions.